How good did it feel to be done with all 7 summits?
It was amazing. It's bittersweet though, because on the one hand you want it to finish, on the other hand you want it to continue forever.
Right.
It's been an amazing journey. I've met, for me, the 7 summits are by no means the hardest climbs in the world. That goes without saying. It's a challenge that was put together that is, I think, a wonderful introduction for people to get to know the mountains. And I think it's a beautiful challenge to be able to kind of show them different climbing cultures around the world. And for that, it's been wonderful. I learned how to climb, on the 7 summits. I've met amazing people. I've learned a lot about different cultures, climbing cultures around the world from the 7 summits. But, to answer your question, on the one hand, it's amazing because you're finally done with it. You finally completed all 7. On the other hand, I was there kind of going, oh, well, now this is done. Now where am I going to go next? Like, what's the next thing?
This episode, I'm pretty much speaking with the real life version of Laura Croft. I'm speaking with Nadia. She's a globe-trotting mountaineering adventurer whose pursuits have taken her to the top of the highest mountains in every continent. And she's climbed arguably the most dangerous mountain in the world, Annapurna. Her story to me was fascinating because she did not grow up in a family with a great exposure to mountaineering. I'm always fascinated when someone with a humble understanding of mountaineering can make their way to its elite levels. If you're interested in travel, mountaineering, or conquering big tasks, this is a great podcast for you. So, let's get into it.
Your story of not knowing anything about mountaineering to conquering all 7 summits and so many more mountains is beyond inspiring. It's almost comical. Like, you had no experience with hiking. Could you talk about how your initial story with Kilimanjaro, I think, is such a fun entry into mountaineering? Do you mind sharing that?
Absolutely, yeah. So Kilimanjaro was where it all started for me. I was 14 in Kenya visiting family friends with my parents at the time, with my family. And we were between Kenya and Tanzania. And at a certain point, the clouds parted. We saw Kilimanjaro, and the family friends we were with, he's Kenyan. And so he mentioned that when he was growing up in Kenya, one of their big school trips was to go and climb Kilimanjaro. And he said, it's so difficult, and, we couldn't make it, and the weather and this and that. And, we had a little bit of kind of light banter between us. They're very good friends. And he said, oh, I bet you couldn't do it. And that's the worst thing to tell me, because I will take that as a dare and then I'll go and do it. And that's exactly what happened. So it was challenged, was dared at 14. I nagged my parents constantly, and we actually went back as a family. So we climbed Kilimanjaro as a family when I was 15. And when I was there, I heard about the 7 summits, heard about this challenge, and started to become interested in it. We'd also spent a few years in Switzerland when I was growing up. So I'd also kind of heard stories of some of these famous climbers, and then heard the 7 Summits Challenge and started to take it on from there. So, but it all started on a dare. And as you said, had no hiking experience, wasn't the most outdoorsy. So it was, kind of learning from nothing and going from there.
Yeah. Would you say your family even had experience outdoorsy, like your mom and dad?
Not really. Both my parents grew up in Karachi, which is a big city in Pakistan. So no, they were big city people, not really much experience outside, definitely not hiking. My father did do a few sports here and there, but it wasn't anything, that was really close to nature. So this was a very big departure from what I grew up with.
And so you think it's your time in Switzerland that introduced you to kind of the history of alpine climbing?
A little bit. I'd heard stories. I started to read a little bit about Messner and learned, more about Messner. And, being in Switzerland, we started to ski a little bit. So became a little bit familiar about being outdoors and in nature and skiing and snow. So started to kind of get more of an appreciation for it there. But I mean, really, it started with Kilimanjaro and with this entire experience. It grew from there. The seed was planted, and then it sort of evolved. So, I mean, first it was Kilimanjaro, where it felt really good and it felt like a strong climb for me. From Kilimanjaro, I went to Elbrus, which, the first time I was on Elbrus was an absolute disaster. So the climbing journey kind of evolves from there, of, having a solid Kilimanjaro, then really suffering on Elbrus and kind of learning week and how I needed to improve. And then it grew from there.
Was that a nice check for you in some sense? Because Kilimanjaro is a nice hike, but I wouldn't say there's any technical challenge to it, or maybe like rarely adverse weather. And then Elbrus can kind of introduce a lot of other factors that you might not have been familiar with.
Absolutely. And I think for me, it was a good check. It was a good learning, also because I happened to stumble on kind of the right building blocks to be able to learn after that Elbrus trip. But it was a rough entry into kind of learning to climb, because I was there with next to no background. I mean, I'd climbed Kilimanjaro. I thought I was this superstar climber, and go to Elbrus having not trained at all, having no background in, putting on crampons, carrying a pack, moving for several hours during the day, because Kilimanjaro is, small days. It's not bad.
Yeah.
Carrying anything, it doesn't get tremendously cold, none of that. And then I get to Elbrus, where you're carrying your pack, it's long days out, you're putting on crampons. We got hit with a storm. I didn't have my own climbing boots at that time, so I rented a pair of these plastic climbing boots from the company I was climbing with. I had horrible blisters. The whole thing was just a disaster. And I mean, it was so bad, and I was in such bad shape that the company that I was climbing with, the guide, actually told me, he said, "You'll never be a climber. You don't have what it takes to be a climber." But during that Elbrus trip, I also met my mentor, my climbing mentor, and he, I think, saw this young girl suffering, took me under his wing, and he had done the 7 summits at that point. He'd done Everest. So he took me under his wing and kind of started, teaching me what I needed to know about the mountains, moving in the mountains, and kind of self-preservation training, and got to a point where I started to feel much better about how I was moving. And then it really started to take off after Elbrus.
That's so interesting. I'm getting a hint into how you're motivated. Like, even with your original Kilimanjaro story, it's just a friendly jibe of like, oh, you can't do that climb. And you're like, oh, watch me. It seems similar with Elbrus, where someone's like, you can't be a mountaineer. Like, oh, well, watch me.
Absolutely. I think it's a common theme. I mean, and whether it's with mountaineering or kind of your approach to life, I think it's something that I've internalized, quite a bit. You'll be told by many people that you can't do something, or that something's impossible, or that it's out of reach. And I've always kind of had that personality of questioning, well, why? Why is it out of reach? Why is it impossible? Why haven't we, and that's at work as well. That's within a corporate environment. That's, in school, that's when you're learning things. It's, why is it done this way? Why do we just take things for granted and assume that this is what it is? And certainly the same thing propelled me within climbing. I had this very male dominated sport. I was usually the only female climbing in a lot of these situations. And I had, older men telling me, oh, you can't do something. So I said, well, why? Why can't I be here? Why don't I deserve a seat at this table as well? So
where do you think that rebellious spirit comes from?
I don't know. I think my parents would say probably from having dropped me too often as a baby. I genuinely don't know. I think it's just part of the DNA, part of my fabric, part of how I grew up, and and perhaps also connected to, my family is Pakistani in heritage, but I've grown up, with this incredible privilege of them being very open-minded and very progressive, and giving us the best education, giving me all the same opportunities as my brother. But I've also seen, the reality of the ground in Pakistan. A lot of times that's not the case for young women. And it depends. There are still certainly lots of people who do afford their daughters and sisters and whatnot a large degree of, freedom and liberty and a great education and whatnot, but it's not necessarily granted. And so part of the rebellion is that, I've had the ability to explore so much and do so much. And so it's kind of trying to maximize that, really. It's pushing against the grain and saying, how much can I squeeze out of this? So.
Yeah. And I would imagine growing up in 10 different countries would allow you to say, oh, hey, they do it this way. Why do you guys do it this way?
Absolutely.
Shouldn't I do it this way? Like, I think it would afford you some sort of latitude in your culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think great learning experience. My parents made this conscious decision when we were young to do an expat lifestyle. So we essentially followed my father around with his job as he kind of took on new roles. And it's absolutely, as you're saying, that, you get exposed to so much, and then it really does make you kind of sit down and go, okay, well, maybe this is done better somewhere else. So why are we so rigid in our way of approaching this? And it allows you then, as you're building your own life, I call it my tortoiseshell life, essentially, that I'm carrying kind of my basics to each new place that I go. But in your tortoiseshell life, you're also taking the best bits of each of these countries and how they do things and taking it to your next spot. So.
I love that. That's a great analogy. Yeah, because I was going to ask you, like, if I said, where's home, where would would you really have a one-word answer?
No. I mean, I've tried to answer this so many different ways. And it's interesting because the person who's asking you the question generally has some way that they've defined what home is, right? Like, for some people that I've spoken to, it's where were you born? And I was born, but, was there for such a short time, I wouldn't consider myself British. So some people will say, where were you born? Some people will say, what's the citizenship you carry? Some people will say, well, where is it that you spent the most time, cumulatively growing up, to date? Some people would say, where were you educated? Some would say, well, where's your family heritage? And for me, each of those questions has a different answer. And so it becomes really difficult. So what I tend to say at this point is, where is the place where you've got most of your stuff in the moment? And
That's
right
funny.
now, so we'll see where it goes from here.
Yeah, you're like Carmen Sandiego growing up. You're just hopping all over.
Exactly.
What country did you spend the most time in growing up?
So I was educated predominantly in the States. So I
Okay.
did my undergraduate and graduate studies in the States. So I did my undergrad at Georgetown University and then moved over to Columbia and New York for my graduate studies. So that's 6 years right there. And then worked in New York for about 2 years, worked in DC for 1 year. So I would say cumulatively the most time has been in the States, as you can maybe pick up from my little bit of a jumbled accent at this point. So
Yeah, your accent's interesting.
bit of a-
Do people try and guess where you're from if they hear it?
they do, and nobody has gotten it.
Yeah,
What are they going to guess?
that's awesome. Can we jump back to, I'd love to hear about your Denali first attempt.
Perfect.
Where does Denali fit in the 7 summit checklist?
So Denali for me was my penultimate. So I did Everest after Denali. I think it was my penultimate. Yeah, I did Everest after Denali. And I think that's actually a really good way to go. I think for me, this might be contentious, but I would actually argue that Denali might even be harder than the 8,000ers. And the reason that I say that is because you're carrying a lot of weight on Denali, which, when you do the 8,000ers as a commercial climber, and by that I mean like you've got Sherpa support and you're going within a commercial setting, a lot of times it's the Sherpas who are carrying the loads, the majority of the load. And by load, I mean, they'll carry communal kit, so they'll carry kind of the food, they'll carry the fuel, they'll carry the oxygen, they'll carry the camp setup, the gas canisters to be able to, to burn down the snow for water, the pots, the things that you'll eat out of, your utensils, etc. They tend to carry that. And then on the 8,000ers, they go a step beyond and they actually start carrying client kit as well, which doesn't sit tremendously well with me. On Denali, you're carrying that. So what happens is, you've got your own stuff, but then on top of that, what happens is they will actually kind of put down all of the communal kit that you're going to be carrying, all the food, all the tents, everything. And then they divvy that up. And obviously it's not kind of a set, everybody carries 50 pounds worth because, somebody like me who is, don't know in pounds and in feet and inches, but, I'm 163 centimeters and 52 kilos. I'm not going to be carrying the same as somebody who's 100 kilos and, a giant, but divvied up somewhat equitably, but you are carrying a lot of weight and it's much more than what you're used to carrying. So I would actually argue Denali is probably harder than the 8,000ers. And for me, it was a perfect prelude to going to the 8,000ers because it did, really test my limits and it made me carry heavy. We were exposed to a lot of, serious weather. Big days out, so fantastic experience, but also challenging. And as you said, it was the first of 2 rounds on Denali, so the weather is a problem on Denali.
Yeah, that's the part that would have broke me, or what I imagine breaks so many people is your first attempt, you get 20 meters away from the summit.
Yeah.
So I think that's 10 meters, 30 feet, so like 66 feet away from the summit or something.
It was brutal.
It's so, I can't even imagine that frustration.
It was brutal. It's really, and the thing is, you go into Denali knowing that the fail rate is pretty high on it. And again, much of that fail rate, is because it's a hard climb, of course, but then it's also got really tough weather conditions. So you need to have a really, really good weather window to be able to move on Denali. And people will say, oh, that's with all mountains. And yes, it's with all mountains, but Denali is exposed to so much just based on where it is, geographically, it gets exposed to such harsh conditions that you really do need to have kind of like the perfect conditions. Whereas with other mountains, you've got a little bit more of a flex depending on, where it's located and just kind of how it's positioned in terms of the elements. So we finally had this decent enough shot at going for it. And then 20 minutes out, we were told, okay, no, conditions aren't good enough. So, 20 meters out, not minutes. We were told conditions aren't good enough. We have to pull back. And that was just brutal. It's a bar to the knees, that.
I would start crying. Did you start breaking down like right away?
I wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough. But you hear about people, you meet people when you go to Denali and it's their third time back, fourth time back. On that first trip, I was in my group, there was somebody that was their third time back, didn't get it. The next trip back that I took to Denali, the second time around, it was their fourth trip. They didn't get it on that one either. So it's part of the mountain, and I think it's a great lesson. I think it really teaches you what it is to climb. In today's day and age, so many of these climbs are commercial, and you have expedition companies that put it together. So the fail rates are lower than maybe what they used to be. But people assume because of that, you're going to get it. And I think these are really good grounding lessons. And this is what climbing's about. You fail a lot in climbing. So it's a good lesson.
I get that. If you appreciate the whole journey, it's just part of it.
Yeah, exactly.
At the same time, though, imagine when you're hauling a sled full of your stuff across some plain just to get to Camp 1. You must have to tuck it in the back of your head that there's a chance it might not happen. That all this effort, I mean, I can appreciate like the sport of it, but the effort might not be worth it in the sense if your goal is just to get to the top.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other thing, so when you're saying if your goal is just to get up to the top, I think that's one thing that you hear a lot. Everybody says very philosophically, oh, well, it's about the journey. And that's great. And I appreciate it. You need to appreciate the journey, but you also, I mean, you're doing it because you want to get to the top, right? Like there is a definite end point in this journey, and you're on the journey to reach that. But that's not to say you shouldn't enjoy the journey as well. And I think one of the problems is that people are so focused on just hitting the goal and checking the box that they don't appreciate that journey. But end is where you go. People don't say go to college to appreciate the journey. You want to go to college to get the degree. So it's climbing. So
that's it. Yeah, just stick to a Stairmaster if you just want to indefinitely.
So
I could say that's an interesting balance to pursue. How rewarding was it then your second time when you finally made it to the summit?
Amazing. And I feel like I'm not a particularly superstitious person, but I feel like sometimes life kind of steers you the way that it needs to. My second time around on Denali was amazing. I met a great group of people on my first trip. I actually ended up befriending my guide and I don't want to even say junior guide because he's not junior in any capacity, but maybe he was there kind of learning with that company. So he wasn't the main guide. I did them on the first trip. The quote unquote junior guide was actually there for my second trip. I went back with the same company and then went back with two of my friends, one of whom was my climbing mentor. So my second trip around was actually fantastic.
Oh, from Elbrus?
From Elbrus, yep. So,
very fun.
Yeah, so we've stayed in great contact over the years, and then he said, he'd come and join on that trip, and then another friend from another climb that I did also came and joined. So the second Elbrus trip was amazing, just all around. Elbrus Denali trip was amazing all around. But it was, being able to finally get to the top, having it be just this bluebird perfect day. Being able to do that with friends there, feeling like I was in my top form, because I think I came back to Denali the second time around just in monster form, ready to try and go as fast as possible on summit day so that we wouldn't have that 20 meters and weather closing in situation. It was bliss. It was wonderful. So
does that feeling of bliss occur at the top or when you get to the bottom and you can reconcile the whole? How long are you there? A month?
You have generally the permit for Denali is about, I think it's 21, maybe 22 days max.
Okay.
Mountain. And my first time around, we maxed that out. We were there for, I think, 21 days on the mountain. And then the second trip, I believe we were there for 14 days. So so it's long. I mean, Denali is also long. And that's kind of another point where I say it's harder than the 8,000 is, because 8,000 is you're in a relatively comfortable base camp setting. And then when you're ready to go for the top, 4 to 5 days, you're up, you're down, and it's done. So yeah. But I think I missed your original question. You'd asked something.
So when does like the joy of having completed the mountain hit at the top or when you get back down?
Gosh, I want to say, I mean, the top is nirvana. It's incredible when you get there. And maybe even just kind of right as you're doing your last few steps up to summit, when okay, now there's no turn back. We're there. I see it.
Are you looking around like, hang on, everyone's good? Yeah.
Exactly. I've learned you don't get that feeling at 20 meters out. You need to still kind of but certainly as you're reaching the top, it's magic. And then, the entire way down is magic. And then for me, it lasts quite a while after. They talk about the hedonic treadmill and kind of being on it for a certain period of time and getting that feeling, that kick, that high, but then you fall off it and you kind of need your next high. For me, it lasts for quite a while. So yeah, it's a great feeling.
Are you someone who needs a big goal to be motivated towards to structure like your all of your workouts, all of your like, okay, I'm going to do Denali. Here's how I'm going to do it. And then you start structuring a workout plan. And that's what motivates you, just having that goal.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've spoken with my family and they actually joke with me. They say you're one of the laziest people we know. But I'm lazy without goals. And it's interesting. I've got friends who are really good at just getting into the gym or getting out for a run and just training to train just to stay healthy.
Yeah.
For me, I feel like I'm somebody who's very goal motivated. I need something to structure me. I need something to kind of keep me on track. And I admire both methods. I admire, the dedication that comes from the people who can just get out there and get it done. I also think that there's something really interesting about people who are maybe more oriented the way I am, who kind of need to put down, a flag in the sand and say we're working towards something.
Yep.
But that's how I operate. I need that, whether that's professionally, personally, within my sports. I just need kind of the flag in the sand to work towards.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I feel similar in some ways. How does your training for Denali differ from Everest training?
So it's not actually that different. I did a little bit more strength training on Denali. So knowing that I would be carrying heavy loads, there's, more of a focus on kind of strengthening your back, strengthening your core,
Yep.
kind of your hips and your glutes and your legs essentially kind of ready to carry load. But much of the training is quite similar. So, again, what I've always told people who say, okay, how can we train to be on the mountains without living on the mountains? I say, well, you need to just do whatever you can that's as close as you can to replicating the conditions. So, in this case, you need to have a really strong cardiopulmonary system. So as much as you can do, kind of cardio and really work your lungs and your heart, do it. So I chose to run to do that. For the strength training, I was an avid CrossFitter for many years. That's how I prepped for Denali. And then one thing for the 8,000ers and for Denali, and as you're getting into kind of bigger mountains, is you really want to focus not just on cardiopulmonary going flat and, weight training flat, but you want to kind of replicate it going up. So if you live in buildings that are apartment buildings where you've got access to a staircase, put on your pack and hit the staircase as many times as you can hit the staircase. Your Stairmaster, hiking out for hours and making sure it's on an incline. That's essentially what I was doing to prep for both Denali and for Everest.
Did you do the thing where you pull the tire for Denali?
I didn't. I've seen many people do it. I probably should have, because you mentioned the sled, and the infamous sled on Denali is quite something, and it does pull on your hips and kind of your lower back. And so I should have done it. I didn't, but yeah.
Was this strength and all this training prior to your shoulder surgery?
So it was after. So I had shoulder surgery. So I kind of going on being, I think programmed slightly differently and being a little bit neurotic with my training. I over CrossFitted. So I was really into the sport and ended up overloading my shoulder, tore my rotator cuff, the labrum, and then I had something called an impingement as well. So it was fairly brutal. Had the surgery for it in 2019, and that essentially knocked me out of doing CrossFit for a very long time. And this is how the running started, because I wasn't able to use my shoulder. I couldn't really do weightlifting. I was very limited in being able to use upper body for quite a long time. And so I started running to do something. So that's how the whole running journey started. And then
So are you running in a sling?
I was running when I got out of the sling. So the sling took
Okay.
when I got out. The thing is, even when you're out of the sling, you have kind of a lingering, it's a really tricky area to do surgery on. So you had lingering pain for a while, and I was working through physical therapy, but I couldn't go back to lifting. And CrossFit has a lot of movements where you're kind of on a bar and you're doing a pull-up, where you're doing, you're how can you say, like you're extending with your shoulder, like past your shoulder line with a weight above your head, and I couldn't do those. And so I said, okay, what that doesn't require that much strain on my shoulder? And so I started running, and then eventually built the CrossFit back in when I targeted Denali, which was in 2022. And then, Everest in 2023. So built it in later.
It's so impressive to have an injury like that and then still maintain these pinnacle physical achievements.
It's, it's a process. I think, part of the thing also is that I had this surgery right before COVID started. And, so all of us go into kind of lockdown mode during COVID. So it was also, CrossFit gyms were closed. Even if I wanted to continue, I couldn't. So the running came naturally because of that. But to your point, I think just trying to stay motivated, stay in shape, to your point also about goals, we never knew when we were getting out of this kind of COVID situation. So setting goals, not knowing if it would happen. I was supposed to do Everest in 2020 originally and had that canceled due to COVID. So being able to kind of maintain momentum, train through COVID without having the goal in place was quite tough.
Yeah. I'd love to know, when you get to Everest and you get to base camp, what's that crowd like? How does it differ from, because your last mountain was Denali, which is the mountaineer's mountain. Everyone there knows what they signed up for, but I imagine there's tourists and people who don't really know what they're getting into at the Everest base camp.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you put it perfectly. So I'm going to try and find the polite way to put this. I think the 8,000ers have taken a turn towards heavily commercial now. And, on the one hand, I've talked to a lot of friends who are kind of professionals in the industry about this. And on the one hand, we all think it's wonderful that more people are getting a chance to experience the mountains, experience the big mountains, experience this really cool environment and really kind of learn to appreciate nature. On the other hand, it's pulling in a crowd of people that are not ready to be where they are. And I think one thing that I've really appreciated about this Seven Summits journey is each of these little steps have been, baby lessons, baby steps to getting to these big 8,000 meter peaks. And so, maybe to answer your question about the crowd at base camp in Everest, keeping in mind also that, there's a lot of trekkers coming in just to be at base camp. So some of them are not actually climbing.
Yeah.
But keeping them out of the equation, you've got a lot of people there who are maybe there to check the box, kind of get the big poster that says, they climbed Everest, or the big certificate that says they climbed Everest, without maybe having done the necessary climbs they need to ahead of time. And I find that a little bit concerning because it does make the mountains less safe. On the 8,000ers, you've got fixed lines that you're moving up and down. And so the issue is if you've got people who can't move themselves up and down it well and don't know the conditions, they're going to end up creating a traffic jam on those roads. And that can cause a dangerous situation. So it's a mixed bag. You still have some of the best climbers in the world going to Everest and climbing it a lot of times without oxygen. And then you've got a lot of people who have never climbed a mountain before, especially coming on the south side. And that's where I think there needs to be a little bit of regulation on who's coming in and moving, allowing them to move on the mountain without having experience ahead of time.
Do you have a story of someone who clearly just didn't belong on the mountain?
I do. So I was coming down. So my group was the first group to summit on Everest. So the company I was climbing with were in charge of fixing rope that year. So essentially what that means is that they will send a team of Sherpas to set rope all the way up to the summit. And that allows every other group of climbers that come after to be able to hook onto the rope, essentially clip onto the rope and then go up and down safely. What that also means is that my group essentially moved up first because we were kind of following the Sherpa crew that was setting the rope to go up. So we were the first group to summit. We summited, and then I came down to high camp, essentially Camp 4, and then I went and did Lhotse because Lhotse and Everest share the same high camp, close to the same high camp. So as I was descending down from Lhotse, there was another group that was coming up for Everest, and there was one woman who she was spent. She couldn't do it, and she was being lifted. She had her Sherpa behind her who had his arms under her armpits, and you can't see me fully, but like arms under her armpits, and was hoisting her up to help her take steps up. And when I mentioned kind of traffic jams on the fixed ropes, that's one of the traffic jams I've experienced. So she was still clipped into the rope. The Sherpa was still clipped into the rope. They're moving up at snail's pace, but essentially what they're doing is they're conquering the rope. So we couldn't move around safely. So a lot of us had to wait to go down. During the middle of the day at certain places, that's fine. But then there's risk, obviously. You can have frostbite. You can have rockfall that can hit you if people are standing around for too long. People who have medical emergencies who might need to descend quickly can't get around that. So it does create complications, and that's a clear case where somebody should not have been there. And I've talked to friends as well who mentioned, one mentioned that there was a case on Everest where somebody forgot to clip on their crampons to go to the restroom. Like they came out of their tent, didn't put on crampons, didn't clip into the rope, and off they slid.
Oh my gosh!
Situations like this don't happen if you know what you're doing on the mountains. So.
Ooh, that's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my gosh! Do you how good did it feel to be done with all 7 summits?
It was amazing. It's bittersweet though, because on the one hand you want it to finish, on the other hand you want it to continue forever.
Right.
It's been an amazing journey. I've met, for me the 7 summits are by no means the hardest climbs in the world. That goes without saying. It's a challenge that was put together that is, I think, a wonderful introduction for people to get to know the mountains, and I think it's a beautiful challenge to be able to kind of show them different climbing cultures around the world. And for that, it's been wonderful. I learned how to climb, on the 7 summits. I've met amazing people. I've learned a lot about different cultures, climbing cultures around the world from the 7 summits. But, to answer your question, on the one hand, it's amazing because you're finally done with it. You finally completed all 7. On the other hand, I was there kind of going, oh, well, now this is done. Now where am I going to go next? Like, what's the next thing?
Yeah.
So yeah, bittersweet.
Yeah, I can imagine, like you said, someone goal-oriented. Once you check off the biggest goal on the radar, there is a bit of a void. And did you fill that next with, you said, working through some of the other 8,000 meters, or what? How did you progress after that?
Yeah, so my original plan in 2023 had been to climb all of the 8,000ers. So, following Nim's doing all of the 8,000ers within his 6 months, I think what he did is he showed that, you can do a lot of them together for a couple caveats, right? If you're helicoptering into base camps,
and
if you're using oxygen. And so my goal was, okay, let's try and see how many of them I can knock off. And, part of that, and coming back to the fact also that I have kind of a professional life outside of climbing, right? So to be able to go and climb an 8,000, to acclimatize, to get there, to wait out weather, it takes a long time. So I actually quit my job to be able to go and climb 8,000ers. So when I was there, I said, okay, let's maximize, let's do as many as we can. I started with Annapurna, which is to date probably one of my favorite climbs I've ever done. It's just a spectacular mountain. It's deadly, it's moody, but it is.
That one's wild. Isn't it the most dangerous mountain?
It's the most dangerous of the 8,000ers. Yeah, the stats kind of vary on, how dangerous people would put it at now, but it was, I think, up to a 33. I saw one thing that said a 33% kill rate. Back in the day, one said a 40% kill rate. So yeah, it's a spicy mountain for sure.
Oh my gosh! Do you tell your parents about that stuff before you go in on it?
I did not. No.
Yeah, I wouldn't either.
No, family, friends. I said Annapurna. I mean, they know it's one of them, but I don't think they'd looked at the stats, and I certainly didn't draw a line under the stats to highlight it. When I got down, I think they started to pick up on it, because then I'd start posting, on Instagram about what I was living when I was there, and we had 3 avalanches. One avalanche nearly took out our team. Our rope came ahead. I mean, it's a very, very tricky mountain. And again, it's because of the avalanche risk predominantly. It's not, I think I'm always curious with the stats on where are they drawing these stats from? Like, what are your parameters to be able to pull this data, right? Because Mont Blanc, for example, has a fairly high death rate as well, but it's because kind of you can walk onto the base of Mont Blanc from town and you'll have a lot of people kind of having accidents there. So it's not necessarily that it's such a dangerous mountain. Annapurna is, because it's avalanche. It's not, human error. It's not things that you can really reduce that much. It's avalanche, and that you can't tell when it's coming. So it's quite something.
Do you have an internalized risk calculus?
Sort of. I have a lot of respect for the mountains. I don't push, and that's something I've had to learn, actually. I used to push more. So I would have guides who would say, we're not continuing, conditions aren't safe. And I would say, come on, let's go, it's fine. It's something that I've learned over years, was naivety, and it was youth, and it was not smart, but it's been correcting itself over the years. And now when I've got a guide or somebody who knows the mountains who says no go, I say, okay, fine, no problem. We go down, and it is what it is. But you go into the sport knowing that there's risk, and it's part and parcel of it. And certainly you can choose to take more or less risk. You could choose to be on an Annapurna or, next on a K2. And you can kind of weigh up how much risk you're willing to take. I think for me at this stage, I don't have children, I don't have dependents. So I'm willing to take a little bit more right now and be on mountains that might be a little bit more dangerous.
Yeah.
That's probably going to evolve over time. And I'm probably going to go for less risk at some point. So
was Annapurna your scariest climb?
Yeah, I would say so. Absolutely. The 7 summits, I don't feel tremendously at risk on the 7 summits. I think that with good weather reports, with solid guides, I think it's a fairly set of climbs to do. So I'm not too worried about the risk. But Annapurna, I mean, we had 3 avalanches that came out of nowhere. And you have to move on the mountain. So obviously where you camp is relatively safe, but besides that, you're moving on the mountain. You move as fast as you can, as efficiently as you can, as safely as you can. But when they come, and you can't do anything to fix that. So,
do you have a story where you feel like you got away with something?
Where I got away with something? No, I mean, nothing, maybe Annapurna, just, these,
Yeah, no, that's good.
yeah, just these avalanches getting quite close. And, I mentioned we camp in places that are safe, but even we were camped at Camp 2, our rope fixing team went ahead. This was the incident that I said where they nearly got taken out by this avalanche. Thank goodness they were safe. They were maybe 5 minutes away from it. Had they been moving, they took a break, and had they been moving, instead of the break,
Yeah.
But then we kind of saw the avalanche also coming towards us at Camp 2, and in the end we're safe based on where we are, but you do see it coming. We got I call it like the magic fairy dust sprinkle of the avalanche. So we did still get a little bit of the blowback from it, and I think that just kind of gives you a moment of pause where you're going, oh gosh, it was close, it was right there, and but other than that, I don't think so.
Does the general order of mountains in the greater zeitgeist frustrate you? Like, I always think people know Everest, maybe they know Denali, but like after that, I feel like it drops off pretty quickly. Does conquering something like Annapurna be like, do you guys know what I just did? You know how impressive that was, and does that frustrate you at all?
It's a good question. So yes and no, I think, is the easy way to put it. It doesn't frustrate me in the sense that I'm not somebody who's necessarily looking for the pat on the back and the accolades and the clapping. And, I don't need that. So much so that for me, I kind of begrudgingly opened up Instagram and social media and started posting about this stuff. But my reason for doing it was because I was seeking sponsorship for the 8,000er climbs. Otherwise, I mean, I've gone under the radar up until I think I opened the account in 2021. I didn't post about any of this, and nobody knew about it. But then on the other hand, you do kind of wish that more people knew more about other mountains. And, people always come back to Everest and they say, oh my gosh, you climbed Everest and that's amazing. And Everest is amazing. It's a beautiful mountain, but there's so many other cool climbs in the world. And there's so much that is so much cooler than Everest.
Yeah.
Annapurna being one of them, but Mayo in Peru is another spectacular climb that unless you're a climber, you don't know about it. And there's so much more out there that I think deserves so much more respect. Some amazing technical climbs in the Alps, amazing technical climbs in Pakistan and in Nepal that people don't know about, but the alpinists who are going and doing them are getting the Piolet d'Or, for example, for setting up routes on some of these amazing climbs. So yes and no. I think it depends on how much you want kind of the applause and the recognition from people who aren't climbers, and not bothered by that. But I wish more people knew about other mountains and other climbs, because there's a lot out there that's amazing.
Yeah, that would just drive me nuts personally, doing all that and then being like, oh, where's that again? Be like, oh no, I took so much time trained for this. Could you talk about climbing in Peru?
Oh my gosh, it's amazing. So climbing in Peru is Peru climbing is one of my favorite places to go to climb. It's beautiful, it's pristine. I think one of the things that I really like is you don't have that many people out there, which is a real
I'd never heard of like that as a climbing destination before you brought it up.
Fantastic. It's fantastic. It's so the 7 summits, because of kind of the challenge and the checking the box, the bucket list, they've become very popular and they've become very commercial. And again, a lot of people there. Similar to Everest, a lot of people there. And now the 8,000ers are becoming that as well, right? So you do have that many more people on the 8,000ers now than you ever had before. Some of the 8,000ers less so. So in Annapurna, not as many as you'd have on an Everest by any means. But, even K2, the numbers are going through the roof now. And I think they're just becoming very popular mountains now because of, the 14 peaks with NIMS. Kristen Harilla recently breaking that record. So it's kind of popularizing because of that. But going back to Peru in particular, I think for me, one of the amazing things about Peru is that there's nobody out there. It's beautiful. It's because it's not one of these bucket list places, it doesn't matter if it's set, 7 peaks or 14 peaks or whatever. People are not out there in mass quantity. So it's this little haven with beautiful climbing. It's pristine, amazing mountains, amazing climbs. Mayo is a fantastic ice climb, which was probably one of my favorite climbs as well to date. It's an incredible culture, climbing culture out there, really good vibes. And that's what I'm looking for more and more now. I'm keen to kind of get away from the crowds and go where there's a really, amazing culture, local culture, good people, climb with good people, have a good team around me, and explore mountains that maybe are not where you kind of have the mass crowds and Instagram.
Yeah. Is that coming from more of a place of an adventure mindset? Like, I want to see places fewer people have seen, or is it just the crowd subtract something from the experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I got into climbing as a dare, as we covered, but
Yeah.
evolved, and I mean, at first it was a dare, then it was kind of pushing back against this, again, ornery older man who was telling me I couldn't do something.
Yeah.
And then it kind of became like a personal battle, for myself. But then it kind of evolved into, I really enjoy being in nature, and this is my downtime and my disconnect time. My phones don't work, internet doesn't work, unless you're at Everest Base Camp. But it's this amazing kind of moment that you have with nature and with yourself, and you're pushing your limits, and you're constantly on the mountains. You're constantly having a conversation with yourself. You're constantly kind of going, okay, how am I feeling? What can I do? How can I mitigate this? How can I kind of push through this tough spot? Is this a tough spot I really need to be listening to? Am I really feeling unwell, or you're constantly having this conversation and, testing yourself. And I like being able to do that in some degree of serenity. I like being able to do that, without massive crowds, without having to navigate that person who's hanging off the rope because they're not meant to be there because, they've never climbed a mountain before.
Mm-hmm.
And I desire to get to those kind of mountains and also more technical climbs or first ascents is this desire to kind of keep having this conversation with myself, keep being able to understand where my limit is, understand my own abilities in the mountains, but being able to do it with the solitude that I really crave and the peace that I really crave about, going into nature for. So
yeah, it's cool to watch your evolution of the relationship you have with climbing and the outdoors. Like you said, from kind of the outside in to being part of it, and then finding your own identity separate from those accomplishments. It's fun to watch. And part of why I actually really enjoy Instagram and following climbers like you and the whole app and social media process is your stories and accomplishments I wouldn't have known about were it not for these social media apps. So I'm curious, like, I don't mean any offense by this, but you seem like a social media introvert.
fair.
Is that fair to say?
I think it's very fair to say. I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with social media.
Yeah.
The love part of it is similar to what you're saying, right? It's that I think it's an amazing platform to be able to learn about what people are doing, to be able to connect with people. I mean, I've had the amazing ability to connect with all sorts of fantastic climbers and enthusiasts as well. I mean, it's just amazing people on the platform.
Yeah.
The downside is that it's a lot of self-promotion, and I think there's a lot of I think there's too much attention on being a social media climber as opposed to kind of a real climber, right? Like people will, especially on the 8,000ers, I'm finding that there are a lot of people out there who are more focused on what is going to be clickbaity and what's going to really attract the audiences.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is because it goes hand in hand with getting media attention and getting sponsors, right? And it's kind of all connected. There's this like chicken and egg thing that's going on there. And the downside of that is that a lot of times you're getting kind of influencers who are being sponsored to do these climbs, but that sponsorship is then being taken away from professional climbers. And I would not put myself in the professional climber. I'm not talking about myself here, but I know people who are professional climbers who have had sponsorships and partnerships with brands being pulled because they're not either active enough on social media, or they're not, posting exactly what the brand wants, or they're not creating the content that the brand wants. And that's time that's being pulled away from them actually being climbers. So it's a bit of a weird, I have a weird love-hate relationship with social media for the same reasons. I'm not a content creator.
Yeah.
And what I'm putting out there, I don't know that everybody needs to know about my whole life. I don't know that my whole life is that interesting. I'm putting out my climbs, but it seems like that's not really what social media is about anymore. It's almost like an overshare machine. That's a space that I'm trying to kind of understand how comfortable I am engaging with.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I like the way you approach it now. It feels like a journal in a lot of ways, like where you post your reflections, and it's fun seeing how you understand certain events of your life.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
Did you keep an actual journal during your hikes and trips?
No, I didn't keep an actual journal. It's probably something I should have done. I tend to take a lot of photographs. So for me, it was photographing, videoing quite a bit. I also collected a lot of like random scraps. So coming back to my mentor that I met on Elbrus, he used to create these sort of scrap photo album books from all of his climbs, that he did. And so I think I started kind of emulating that. So, I'd keep the candy wrapper from Summit Day, from Alpa Maya,
Oh, yeah.
Part of a horseshoe that I found when I was doing, and, the ticket from my trip to Antarctica for Vincent. So I started kind of collecting all the scrap and then, the photos as well, and kind of started putting things together, but never an actual journal. I should have done that as well. Would have been a good addition.
You could do the first, you know how a lot of climbers have books now?
Yeah.
You could do like a replica scrapbook.
Yeah.
Do that one instead. That'd be good.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. I love that. We used to do like I have a friend that keeps all their plane tickets from trips and does like that same scrapbook idea where it's all sorts of like little mementos from the experience.
Exactly. Yeah, it's great. And then, you see it years later and it's just this amazing little memory book of what you were living. So
would you humor me for some speed round questions?
let's do it.
Okay. I'm curious, of the countries you have lived, is there one type of cuisine that stands out as most nostalgic for you?
Oh, goodness, that's tough. I'm a huge foodie. I love to cook and love to eat. So hard to pick just one. I think probably one of the best food experiences I've had from the countries I've lived in, besides Pakistan, which obviously like my home food is close to heart, would probably be Turkish cuisine, I think. I love Turkish cuisine. I think it's this amazing, very unique cuisine type. So I would say that. But keep in mind, hard question, because I've also lived in France, which has some of the best restaurants in the world.
Yeah.
So it's tough. Yeah.
Yeah, and New York too, right? I imagine that's pretty good.
Absolutely. Yep. Some of the best restaurants in the world there. So that's tough.
Oh, so you like to cook a lot too?
I love to cook. Yeah, I love to eat. This is another thing, I think it comes also from having lived abroad so much. You get to try all these amazing cuisines and then you want to be able to replicate it at home. So you meet people from each of these countries and, they're kind enough to share their family recipe with you for this amazing dish. And then, you kind of take it forward with you and you keep replicating.
Familiar with like food as a love language?
Yes.
What culture have you lived in where the culture is like most pushing on, like, here, we made all this food for you, please welcome?
I mean, Pakistan, home.
Yeah.
But I think in general, it's a very Eastern thing, but I think, you find it in the West as well, but I think it's very much like it's like a national sport to push food on people in the subcontinent. So in the East, in India, Pakistan, the Middle East, it's just this, this big thing to push food on people. So.
Oh my gosh. Did you have climbing? I know you had your Elbrus mentor, but were there other climbing idols or heroes you looked up to as you journeyed?
Yeah, not many of whom I met personally, but a lot of stories. Holt Messner growing up obviously was a massive figure. I'm gonna absolutely slaughter her name, but Gerlinde Kaltenbrunner. She did amazing things on the 8,000ers, so she's always been a hero for me. Similarly, Edurne Pasaban, she's a Spanish climber, and she's a massive figure also on the 8,000ers. So she was a huge source of inspiration. Coming from Pakistan, Ali Sadbara as well. He sadly passed away during the K2 winter ascent, but he's an incredible figure who was absolutely a role model for me. So yeah, there've been many great figures out there, and there's also an incredible crop of climbers now that are on the 8,000ers or rock climbers or in the Alps that are incredible sources of inspiration. Some of them I know personally as well. So yeah, absolutely, a lot of figures to look up to.
Yeah. Think about your own legacy as a climber. Like, does being a female climber that accomplished all of this mean something to you, or how do you hope like a young girl or a young woman who's interested in climbing sees your accomplishments?
It's a really good question. I mean, they're important to me personally. Just again, because my own personal journey is kind of about figuring out my limits, being able to kind of test my boundaries, being able to keep learning about myself and seeing what I'm capable of. So they're important to me for that. But, if what I'm doing can serve as some sort of a rubric for inspiring young women, potentially young women from my part of the world where this is not so common, it only makes me happy to be able to be a positive role model in whatever capacity I can be. And I've been lucky enough to hear a couple of young girls saying that this is an inspiration for them, and it was seeing my story was what gave them the strength to be able to kind of talk to their families about wanting to get into sports or the outdoors or climbing, and that, it's obviously very uplifting. I wish more were being done in Pakistan specifically to be able to further women in outdoor sports. It's still very difficult to get women outside and into the sports arena in the country. It's just not common. So I wish more were being done for it, but if there's any way that, doing what I do can be a source of inspiration and in any way be a small part in driving forward change, I'm only happy. So
Hearing someone give you that comment has got to almost match summit emotions, right?
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's an amazing feeling. I just wish there was more that I could do personally. And maybe there is, and maybe it's just kind of about finding out what that is. So
yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Do you have a book you recommend everyone should read?
oh gosh. I liked Anatoly Borkrev's book. I'm forgetting the name. I think The Climb. I believe it's The Climb. I'm really bad with memorizing titles.
Okay.
I loved his book.
I'm the same way. I'll finish it and be like, I don't know what I just read. Like, I can tell you all about it, but I forget the name and the author.
I tell you, I'm terrible with titles and I'm terrible with authors. I've read the book and I can tell you what the book's about, but I'm so terrible. Right?
I'm the same way.
Yeah, but no, I think climbing books, that was a favorite of mine. And then, otherwise a whole bunch of different books, but I'd have to pull titles for you. So
yeah. Are you a big reader?
Yeah, getting to be more. And
Okay.
it's the beautiful things I think about climbing, especially when you're on the mountain for a long period of time and there's a lot of time at either base camp or where you're able to kind of carry a book or an ebook with you up the mountain. It's something I've been getting into more.
Yeah. And then last question is, what's the best way for people to follow or support you?
That would be amazing. So following my journey, I'm trying to create more of a love relationship with Instagram. So I commit to trying to be better at it. But Instagram would be great. That's where I'm going to be posting, I think, most of my climbs and my next steps and the goals. So certainly there, and hoping to get my website back up and running again. So we'll see if I can get enough momentum going, and I might head out for the 8,000ers again. So
awesome. Well, Nadia, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Great chatting.
Huge thank you to Nadia. Thanks so much for joining. Really appreciate the time. And thank you for listening. Be sure to hit like, follow, subscribe, every button on the podcast so you can stay tuned for the next episode.